just to sort of bring us up to where we are, we're talking about principles, and a principle seems to be different from a virtue, and yet a lot of what we talk about as principles are really virtues, like honesty and things of that kind. So I suppose we don't have to get too literal. We have some great examples in the big book of a principle. You have the one that's ascribed to Herbert Spencer. There is a principle which is bar to all information, which is proof against all argument, you know the one, and it says the principle is contempt prior to investigation. Now that's a principle. So what I did was, in trying to find out what principles we might talk about, I found out that there's no fixed canon of principles for AA. And it's probably a good thing, although, we tend to want like 12 or 10 or some numbers. But there's actually probably many more than 12. And I think it's kind of left up to ourselves to figure out what principles are involved in the steps as we work them. So far, we've talked about honesty and surrender in step 1. And surrender is the form of acceptance. The surrender, as I see it in step 1, is a form of acceptance of the dimensions of the problem. Step 2, we talked about open-mindedness, and then we talked about hope. That hope is, it's a realistic hope. It's hope based upon something other than fantasy. It's based upon reliable testimony of other people who have had the experience and who have had the problem and have had the experience of recovery. So it's not something I talk myself into. It's a plan that has results. And I was reminded tonight when I was looking at the thing of hope, something that had puzzled me years ago reading St. Augustine. St. Augustine, is this bishop of Hippo, North Africa. He died like in 430 AD. And he wrote a very famous book, a couple of famous books. One is called The City of God, and the other is called Confessions. And in Confessions, he says this thing which puzzled me. It says, the difference between faith and presumption is humility. And I was puzzled that, because it was like, what exactly does he mean? And then I came to realize that real faith involves the willingness to do what other people do to achieve the result. That's faith. Presumption is where I think that by just an act of my mind, I can achieve the result. And so the typical example would be somebody who, I've seen this on certain telecasts in which people who have, no previous business experience, praise the Lord because they just got offered to be CEO of some multi-zillion-dollar company or something. And I think that this kind of unrealistic hope, I think, is very damaging. What we're talking about is hope that is based upon reliable testimony of other people. And I talked about the guy next door to me and his sob, and how he found a remedy for his sob. He came to believe that Sven could fix his sob. So that gave me hope. We also talked about spiritual principles, because they're very clear in the big book that the steps are a group of principles spiritual in nature. They're spiritual, and spiritual is not religious. Spiritual is a different thing, and we talked about what that was. And a spiritual awakening is not something in which I, spend the rest of my life in church. That it has to do with coming alive. It's liveliness. It's the life that is within me, awakening instead of being asleep. And then we talked about decision in step 3. And we stood at a turning point and we made a decision. And then the commitment, which was where I send all my energy in one direction. Com mittere was the Latin derivation of it. And then surrender, again, in step 3. I talked about turning my car over to Sven. I also talked about the analogy that they used in Hazleton of jumping in the river. Even though you can't swim, there's a forest fire burning behind you, you jump in the river because other people did that and they're safe on a beach over here. They didn't have to swim. They couldn't either. So I just surrendered. So we have 2 kinds of ways of looking at surrender then in those steps. We have surrender in which I surrender to the nature of the problem. I totally accept the nature of the problem. And then I have surrender, again, in step 3 that I see as being surrender to the method of recovery that other people have taken. I surrender my own options. So there's a degree of surrender involved when I stop fighting, I stop trying to do it the easier, softer way, stop trying to leak energy out of the commitment. I give my life over to whatever this process is. So tonight, primarily, I want to talk about the principles that we might find in step 4. And before I do, I forgot to say this last week. You know, these are just my opinions. This is just my a commentary on my walk through the path of the steps. And everybody has his or her own experience of the steps. And I would hate anybody to think that this is sort of authoritative or this is the only way to think about it or anything like this. I see our recovery as a kind of a conversation. And we all contribute to that conversation, and this is a contribution to that conversation. It is not the end of the conversation. As they said in the page 164, it says, "We know but a little, more shall be revealed." You know, and I think this is always the kind of open-mindedness that we need to keep. So if your sponsor has a different opinion on these principles, don't quote me to him or her. Okay, so the common principles that I find in the various lists that are circulated connected to step 4, you will find courage and honesty, and there's one list that has soul searching as the principle. Now, whether those are principles technically or not, it probably doesn't much matter. But they certainly are important ways of approaching things. And it certainly took courage and honesty and soul searching to do a good 4th step inventory. I would like to also suggest that there might be another principle involved. And I got this by going back, as I had said the first night, going back to the Oxford group which preceded AA and what Bill Wilson had joined and Dr. Bob had been a member of. And they had 28 principles. And one of the principles there I found kind of underlies everything we do from step 4 on. And we don't talk about it much. But they state it explicitly. They say that, and I'm going to read their version of it, sin manifested by our selfishness and self-centeredness blocks us from God. Sin manifested by our selfishness and self-centeredness blocks us from God. The AA version of it might be then, if you were to extrapolate the principle, would be our character defects as manifested by our selfishness and self-centered behavior block us from our higher power or the spiritual experience, whichever you like. And I think that is a kind of why we do the inventory, why we do the admission, why we do the willingness to change and give them all up, and why we do restitution. I think the why is that these things block our contact with our higher power. And then a kind of corollary of that would be, by following the steps, we remove these blocks. By following the steps, we remove these blocks. You might be interested to know that the Oxford group called what we call the steps, their steps 9 through 14, they called it soul surgery. And it began with an inventory and an admission and a willingness to change and restitution. That was soul surgery. And as the result of that, one was able to allow the presence of God. So anyway, so that's sort of why I think we set out on this path of doing an inventory. And I think it's important to know why we're doing it and what is the principle lying behind it. We're trying to get at the root of these things that stand between us and the experience of our spiritual experience. So we attempt in writing to do a fearless assessment of our character based upon our behavior. That's what the word moral means. It comes from the Latin word, guess what? It comes from the Latin word moralis, not moralis from chorus line, but it comes from the Latin word moralis, which means got to do with the right or wrong of our behavior. So a moral thing has to do with behavior. So when a jury has to arrive at moral certitude, it's the behavior that an ordinary, prudent person would act upon. So moral has to do with behavior, whether it's good or bad. And so we're trying to find an assessment of our character based upon our behavior. And why is this important, that it's about our behavior? Because my opinion of my character is often skewed by denial. I can think of myself as a very responsible, easy to get along with person. Nobody else in the world might think that about me. And so, I can be skewed in that direction, or I can be skewed by self-loathing in the other direction, where I'm the worst thing in the world. And I have nothing positive. So I think when we talk about a fearless moral inventory, that's where the courage comes in. Courage, comes from the word for heart, right? Cœur, the French for heart, corps in Latin. And so courage means I have to have heart. I have to have this desire arising from faith that I will go out beyond what maybe I can see on the word or belief of from somebody else, on the word of somebody else. So I am going out on faith into some area that I have never gone before. So our fearless moral inventory is the willingness to look at our behavior and what our behavior tells us about our character defects. And there's a difference between faith and belief, and I'm sure a lot of you have sort of thought about this. Belief, one of the best ways I can think about it is that, Pythagoras, who lived 500 years before Jesus, a guy, Eratosthenes, who lived before Pythagoras, all knew that the earth was spherical. They believed it was a sphere. So sometimes we think that it was in the Middle Ages that people still thought the earth was flat. Anybody intelligent up through the Middle Ages all believed that the earth was spherical. They believed that. But you know what it really took faith? Was to get in a boat and not hug the coast, like somebody who can't swim, going around the edge of the pool. No, I mean, there's a lot of people did the hug the coast thing, but Columbus and the idiots with him, headed straight out west. That's heavy-duty faith. 2,000 years before it, people believed it was a sphere. Magellan kind of then did, about 20 years later, he did a circumnavigation of the sphere. But, nobody had really, as far as we know, had the faith on this thing that people believed for 2,000 years. I don't think I want to try that. So when we talk about faith, we're talking about going out beyond what we are familiar with. And there's again, in developmental psychology, we have a thing. That's just a straight line, in case you can't see it. When we talk about dependence, or we talk about, before we're born, in either case, we are going along a line, a developmental line, they call it. We come out of the envelope, and the coming out of the envelope is called development. So in whether we're coming out of addiction, in which we are enveloped, and it always takes courage to go along a developmental line out of the protective womb. And the parallel is made of the child who is born and who has to learn to, use her limbs so she can navigate, so she can use a fork and spoon, and all of the things. And so we gradually develop skills as we go along, but it takes courage to do that. And so in some ways, in step 4, we are coming out of perhaps a kind of a cocoon of addiction and delusion that often goes with it. And we are going out with the stated purpose of finding out the real state of affairs. And damn it, I think that is a very courageous act. And that's what we're asked to do in step 4. The first night I quoted Marianne Williamson, which some of you are familiar with from the Course of Miracles. And she has this great statement that I really love. I quoted it before, and it says, "It takes more courage to endure the sharp pains of self-disclosure or self-discovery than to choose the dull pain of an unconsciousness that will last the rest of our lives." The sharp pain of self-discovery. And that's what we have been driven to do. We probably would not have elected to do it if we didn't have to, but anyway, so how did we go about this? Well, the big book talks about resentment is the #1 killer. So we start listing all the people we have resentments against. God knows, it's everybody pretty much in my life, and they all done me wrong, and so I have this justified indignation at all these people, right? And so if I list the people I'm resentful toward, then I have to look at myself and see what is it caused this. And I don't know if you've ever had a sponsee who dithered about doing the 4th step. No, I'm sure you didn't. But, you know, there's the one in the big book with the columns, and there's the one in the fourth step with, in the 12 and 12, you know, which is just like, I don't know. And then there's the Hazelton sheets, and there's, you know, everybody's got pet sheets for doing the fourth and fifth step, Joe and Charlie, and, you know. So, and I was doing this, and my sponsor kept wondering when he was going to get a fifth step out of me. And so he finally, he did it the short way. He had me just take the 7 deadly sins: pride, avarice, lust, gluttony, envy, anger, and sloth. And so I, you know, and he gave me 2 weeks to do it. So, and that's how I did my fourth step. I came back later and did the way the big book talked about, which is actually quite thorough in its own way, because it does, you know, listing all those people and then trying to find out what was my part in what was wrong in the relationship. But one of the things I got from that was that whole idea that the program is about connecting me to my fellows. And unless I can honestly and fearlessly look and see what is it I have done with people repeatedly, whether it's oversensitivity or my ambitions or sensitivity to criticism, whatever it was. Why is it I have so many people that I had a resentment against? And what I realized from doing it the big book way was that, as it says, we have been dominated by the world and its people. The real or imagined wrongdoings by them could have destroyed me, and they were destroying me. Sometimes they were wrong, but sometimes I just assumed they were wrong. And so in the process of trying to get a little more connected to human beings, I found that the big book version really did help me. My sponsor, though, in this doing the 12 and 12 version with the 7 deadly sins, one of the things I found out from that was very interesting to me, was that he pointed out stuff that I had not seen further down the road in step 7, where the chief activator of my character defects was my self-centered fears. And you know, years later, when I thought about that, it didn't dawn on me then, but I thought about it later. Look, if I have these kind of normal instincts to be of value, to be financially responsible, to have love and affection and emotion in my life, to have food and drink, to have adequate relaxation and recreation time, if I aggravate those natural instincts and have them run wild because I am afraid I will not get enough of whatever, I am afraid that what I have will be taken from me. These are the self-centered fears. And I think the biggest one is that I am not enough. I am afraid that I am not this enough, that enough, the other enough. Put in your own, fill in the blank. I am not enough. I'm not smart enough, handsome enough, beautiful enough, thin enough, educated enough. I am not enough. And somehow that kind of self-centered insecurity or fear drives a great deal of what we call character defects. And if I look at those natural instincts to be of value, when it's aggravated by my fear that I won't be sufficiently recognized, it becomes pride. If my natural instinct to be financially responsible is aggravated by a fear that I won't have enough and that what I have will be taken from me, I have avarice. If I'm afraid I won't get enough sex and enough emotional security, it will be driven into lust. And if I have that aggravation with food and drink, I will go for what they call gluttony. And I will, if I am afraid I will not be left alone enough and have enough leisure, I will probably overshoot into sloth or laziness. So, and that only leaves envy and anger, which is like, I mean, if you see the role that they play, my envy is that I'm all the time watching in case you have more shit than I have. And anger and resentment and jealousy is that you may take my shit, you know. So, I mean, there you've got the 7 deadly sins, you know, and they're all, and that was the thing I learned from the step 4 in the 12 and 12, is it starts off talking about the natural instincts and how they are aggravated by our self-centered fears. Now, here's a question that occurred to me then. If the chief activator of my character defects is self-centered fears, why am I banging on all the time about working on my defects? Because what's causing them? My self-centered fears. I don't trust. I don't have faith. I don't have confidence that I will have enough, that I am enough, and that what I have will be left with me. If I am going through life agitated all the time by those self-centered fears, I can never have serenity. I can never have peace of mind. I can never have self-acceptance. And I think that might be a principle that I had overlooked for a long time. The importance of the fears. That they actually, in some ways, it's almost like, you know, when I was growing up, we always had a barometer inside the front door, you know, by the hall stand. We had a little barometer, and guests, when they were leaving, would always tap it, you know, because fair, rain mostly in Ireland. But they'd always tap it like somehow they could change the weather by changing the barometer. Well, in some ways, you know, if I'm not dealing with my fears, I'm trying to change the weather by tapping on the barometer. My character defects are the barometer of my fears. So banging away at them without tackling that which is activating them is maybe putting us down a kind of a red herring, after a red herring. So anyway, I throw that out for what it's worth. It may not be worth anything. You know, don't tell your sponsor this is what it means. Okay. The 7 deadly sins, I love how they sound in Latin because I think I'm still a little nostalgic for those days, but not really. Superbia. Guess what superbia means? Avaritia. Luxuria. That's lust. Gula is gluttony. Invidia, envy. Ira, IRA, is anger. And achedia. And that is, in English it's called sloth, but actually it's more like discouragement. It can be discouragement or not caring about anything. And it resembles a bit like what we call depression. You know, for what it's worth, that's the 7 deadly sins. Okay, the Buddhists talk about the three poisons. Any of you familiar with that? The three poisons: greeds, hatreds, and delusion. And greeds are, we want the object of our desire to provide us with lasting satisfaction. An inner hunger that we attempt to quench by objects. When I was 12, I was in boarding school, and I was kind of really introverted, and there was a boy in my English class who had an oblong gold watch, very thin, with a black band, black strap. I used to sit in English class and watch that watch. Because watches in those days were rather rare. I mean, I had a turnip of a thing, that my parents had bought me at 12. You didn't give a 12-year-old a good watch. But anyway, this boy had this watch. And I knew that if I had that watch on my wrist, I would never be unhappy ever again. I was sure of it. Waking up in the morning with that thing, my day couldn't but be good. And it's so funny how persistent that is, that it just has turned from watches to, it can be iPhones, to a partnership, a relationship, a job, a degree. I remember the night before I got my doctorate, I'm walking around the campus thinking, tomorrow I'll be a doctor. I'll never feel bad again. It was like, 30 years later, I'm still with the gold watch, so. Anyway. St. Augustine nailed that. Again, I mentioned Augustine. Augustine was quite a character, and he knew something about trying to fill his needs by objects. And before he became a bishop, he was quite a playboy. And even after he was a father of the church, a bishop, and all of that, he was still having correspondence with his illegitimate son that he had begot sometime way back when he was still a layman. And Augustine knew a lot about human weakness. But one of the things he says is, "Thou hast made us for thyself, O God, and our hearts will remain restless until they rest in thee." And I think that, a life in which we have tried to quench that thirst, to satisfy that greed with all these objects and things and people and relationships, whatever, and eventually I think we get it. Dr. Earl, who was in San Francisco, whose story is in the big book, Dr. Earl talked about the fact that for the first number of years in his sobriety, he was searching for serenity. He searched for serenity. He thought if he got more spiritual, if he got more this, got more educated, got more, and he said one day, finally, he had tried every religion. He had been all over the world at temples and ashrams. And he finally, one day, he's in a temple in Vietnam. And it dawns on him, the only thing separating him at that time from serenity was dissatisfaction with what was. And I remember listening to him speaking in a meeting in San Francisco, and it rang so true for me what he said, that this is the only answer to it. So in step 4, we've kind of tried to talk about courage and honesty, and the fact that these methods of examining our conscience and confessing were how we remedied that. Just as a matter of interest, I have the 6 original steps of AA, just so for reference. Number 1, complete deflation. Number 2, dependence and guidance from a higher power. 3, moral inventory. 4, confession. 5, restitution. And 6, continued work with other alcoholics. So you can see how those were expanded into the present 12, but they contain essentially these principles. And the same principles like honesty and surrender keep recurring throughout the steps. So I don't think you can go, this step has only got this principle and this, I think it's like there's a bunch of principles that apply through many of the steps and through most of our lives. Step 5 then generally is said to be in these lists, again, honesty. We admitted to God, ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs, step 5. So honesty, definitely, yeah. And the other one is integrity, that people often name. So what do we do in step 5? We're sharing with God, ourselves, and another human being. It usually is easier to share with God and ourselves. I don't know what that says, but somehow the idea of sitting down with another human being can really freak us out. Of course, we have avoided admitting to ourselves for a long time, but when we do, then we have sort of admitted this. In writing my 4th step, I remember at times I didn't want to write stuff down. There were things that I knew, but I somehow felt that if I wrote them down, it would make them have happened. I know that's nuts, isn't it? But somehow getting the pen to actually put it down on paper and say, I caused this, was different from just thinking about it in my mind. To actually put it down brought it somehow into reality and made it really have happened. And I was talking before about like how the steps are a kind of a gradual path leading us to sanity, and that sanity could be represented as like, if this is my mind and this is reality, that when my mind coincides with reality, then I'm pretty sane. But if I'm not coinciding with reality, then I'm at least neurotic, if not psychotic. Well, somehow that thing of trying to get my mind to acknowledge what actually I may have caused was a real difficult one. And I finally got it, most of it written down. But telling somebody my secrets was really hard. And I think what it illustrated for me was how self-hating I was. I really judged myself. When we come out of isolation, and the steps, almost all the steps at one point or another in the 12 and 12 talk about, like step 8 says, this is the beginning of the end of our isolation from our fellows and from God. Coming out of our isolation is such a huge part of recovery. And part of my isolation is that I keep my secret secret. Even when I'm with you, you don't know who I am, because I have all these secrets. And so in a way, I kind of, I'm not really with you. A little part of me is with you. The rest, I keep secret. And a lot of our recovery has to do with coming to self-acceptance. And there's no way I can self-accept if I have judged that a whole lot of things about me I cannot tell anybody. So one of the little tools we use in therapy a lot it's called the Johari window, and it's just a window, 4 sections. You see that? I mean, it's not that important, but what it's used for is this. It's used to have people begin to understand how they come to self-acceptance. So it talks about the fact that information about me is divided like in 3 categories. One is public. That's the stuff that anybody knows about me, anybody knows about you. They can, if they are at all interested, they can find it out. And then there's secrets, my secrets, and only I know my secrets. And then there's blind, and blind is stuff that you know about me that I don't know about me. So what they usually do is they'll draw an eye, like it's often used before group therapy, and they'll draw an eye, and this eye sees my public information and the stuff I don't see. This eye sees my public stuff and the stuff that I have as secrets. There's 1/4 that I don't see directly, and you don't see directly. And this is why we do a moral inventory, because the only way I know what is in this is by my behavior. So I told you the story how I was confronted when I was a priest about the fact that I didn't believe. This agnostic cornered me one night at a meeting, and he said, you don't really believe in a higher power. I said, of course I do. I believe in God. I've always believed in God. And I went into this thing, and he told me, he gave me the riddle about if you sold Tylenol, but when you had a headache, you used Advil or aspirin in those days. And he said, so if you used Advil, what do you believe in? And I said, I guess you believe in what you use for your condition. And he said, well, this is what rigorous honesty is. You tell yourself you believe in God, but what are you using to cope with your life? And he says, unless you're willing to see what your behavior is telling you, you will never be able to be honest. And that kind of got across to me rather forcefully what I needed to do to be sane. I had to be willing to look at what my behavior was telling me about my character. And this is what, when people are doing group therapy, they share their secrets because we're as sick as our secrets. So secrets are keeping us from connecting to people. The stuff that I don't know about me, that you know about me, if you will do me this courtesy of telling me in group therapy, that will help me. I may not like it, but it'll help me. And then if somebody, a sponsor or somebody else, can point out to me that my behavior is telling what I really mean. And I had to be confronted on that about my program. Because I was telling myself that, I love AA, I'm really into AA, I'm committed to it and all of that. And the guy said, well, we don't see you at many meetings and you're not working with any sponsees and, and you're right. You're right. My behavior is telling me what my lying mind is not. So to admit what my behavior tells me is a really important thing. And so when I admit to God and myself and another human being, have you ever sat down and admitted to God what is in your fourth step? It's an odd thing, and I found that what it did for me was it suddenly made me realize that I was known far better, and that my description of me was a poor attempt at describing who and what I was. I was known already. And as honest and as thorough as my attempt to describe me was, it probably was not even approaching the reality. And I found that for me to get into meditation afterwards, one of the greatest inductions for meditation for me to shut up my mind was to say, just sit and know that you are known. No description of you is any way relevant. You are already known. What is. And your description of what is not adding anything to it. So, really, think about it. One of the great things about the admitting to another human being, my sponsor, Father Joe, was about 20 years sober by the time I did my fifth step with him. He was an older priest. He had been through an awful lot. He had been kicked out of the Archdiocese of Chicago for drinking. You have to drink a lot to get kicked out of the Archdiocese of Chicago. And he was a bartender in Denver, and he liked in a very colorful life, and he and a buddy of his used to play piano in lounge bars and things, and and then he got sober and he got back into being a priest again. So Joe was not easily shocked, and so when I did my fifth step, I was like really nervous about it, and he says, well, why don't we just ride around Sacramento on the freeway? Just ride around, and you tell me it. And I was sort of afraid he might stop and let me out, or make me get out or something. I was like, hey, that's pretty vulnerable, that he's driving, And so I could imagine myself somewhere up in Del Paso Boulevard, thumbing a lift back into Sacramento. And I started telling him all of this stuff, and I told him all the worst stuff first. And I sort of gritted my teeth and just told him everything. And then he shared a few things with me, and I guess mine wasn't that bad. And then I told him the rest of the stuff, and he would just nod, and he would say, yeah, I could see how that would happen. And so I told him all the stuff that I was so ashamed of, stuff I hated about myself, stuff I despised, and I realized that what I was doing was I was opening up a whole area of myself. I was taking the first tentative steps along that line out of the envelope where I was letting one other person know about me. And it was scary. But at the end of it, I hardly dared look at him. And at the end, he said, is that it pretty much? And I said, yeah. He said, well, I think you were pretty thorough. And he said, so do you have time for a cup of coffee? It's like, you want to have coffee with me after that? Now that you know all of that stuff, you want to have coffee with me? And it was like, and so we sat over coffee, and I got a real kind of awakening. I didn't get one of these great, weight lifted off me kind of things, but I got a sense of relief. And he said, how do you feel? And I said, I feel very ordinary. And that was really neat. I wasn't complaining. And he said, just think about this, that you thought you had to come down to ordinary. Getting to ordinary was somehow coming down. I was like, where did you think you were? A drunk, who isn't really hacking it in life, and a priest who isn't hacking it, it's like somehow it's such a relief to admit he's ordinary. And then we had a discussion, which I changed my view of the word ordinary, because you know what ordinary is? If you got promoted in a lot of countries beyond instructor or assistant professor and then associate professor, the top is called ordinary professor. If you as a priest go through all the stages and you finally wind up being made a bishop of the diocese, not an auxiliary or any of these, but the bishop of the diocese, you know what your title is? The ordinary. Yeah, so the word ordinary is as high as any of us can go. That's the top. So somehow, that is quite a relief that, we don't have to be anywhere except ordinary. And if you ever look at a flock of sheep or a flock of ducks or of chickens, and if you saw one that thought they were not ordinary, you would say, what a pathetic pretension. We're members of our species, and the top rung is ordinary. And if we can hack ordinary, we're doing really well. So the sense of integrity that comes with step 3, or step 5 rather, is a surrender in a new sense. We're coming out of that cocoon along the road, tentative steps, in which I am taking the risk that you may know who I am. And the rest of the program is sort of a furtherance of that. I end my AA pitch usually with a story about when I first went to treatment in this fidget farm in Sonoma County, and the first meal they served us, when I'm in there and I don't know anybody, I won't look at them, and my hand is shaking. And it's awful. They serve soup. I mean, that's awful to do to a new person in a treatment center, and they're sitting at a big table with 17 people or something at it, and they serve you soup, and if you have shakes, you don't eat soup. And I'm sitting there and I won't eat the soup, and the guy who runs the place is saying, Seamus, eat your soup. I eat your soup. And I know what's going to happen, and sure enough, I lift the spoon and the stuff starts spilling out. And the guy on the other side of me says, really rude, he says, you got a pretty good shake there. I was so offended. I mean, I was a high official of the Diocese of Sacramento. I want you to know. I had lunch every day with the bishop, and I never ate soup. But nobody would ever remark on my shakes, even if I had. And here's this clown on my right saying, commenting on it. But then the next thing he said introduced me to AA. He said, mine is a lot better than it was when I came in yesterday. And then the guy on the other side says, yeah, I still have mine, but I've been through this for a while longer than you guys. And then an old guy across the table who and he nudged me and he says, see that old fart over there? He's been here a month and he's still putting it in his ear. And I look over and this old guy is beaming, and he's just about getting 2 drops out of the whole spoon into his mouth. And I realized that this is how we connect. We connect not at the level of bragging and strutting and boasting about shit. We connect at the level of the stuff we're most ashamed of. And we went out on the porch, and we're all sitting around, and we're talking about how we lied about our drinking and where we hid bottles and drugs and all this stuff. And it was like, I felt I had found a colony of my fellow Martians. And this is what I mean. This is a place, our fellowship is a place where we who feel isolated, ashamed, and turned in on ourselves are allowed to gradually start to join the human race. And this is the point at which we're grafted back in. And when we're grafted in, the life can start flowing through us again. I think that's all the time we have, so thank you very much.